Hello everyone. It's great to see you again in today's video. After losing the land deed, Diep's husband's family fell into chaos. The creditors' knocks on the door became more urgent, their threats and demands echoing relentlessly. They were out of patience, each one desperate to reclaim their money before it was too late. Meanwhile, Diep's father-in-law and husband grew increasingly tense, their hearts filled with frustration, disappointment, and anger. They couldn't endure it any longer. One late afternoon, Diep's father-in-law and husband decided to find her. They knew she had been staying in a makeshift shack by the roadside, where she had gathered bamboo and banana leaves to shield herself from the elements. Without hesitation, they marched straight there. When Diep saw the two men approaching, her heart pounded. She knew this encounter would not be peaceful. Her husband looked at her with cold eyes, while her father-in-law clenched his jaw, his face red with anger. "How much longer are you planning to hide here?" her father-in-law shouted, his voice as heavy as a hammer striking down. Diep lowered her head, unsure of how to respond. She had nowhere else to go, but in their eyes, she was nothing more than a burden, something they desperately wanted to get rid of. "Because of you, we're about to lose our house. Because of you, the creditors are hounding us every single day. Do you even understand how much we are suffering?" her husband added, his words sharp and cutting deep. Tears welled up in Diep's eyes, but she bit her lip, trying not to cry. She wanted to explain, but they didn't give her the chance. "You're completely useless. You can't earn money, and now you've brought disaster upon us. You're nothing but a curse," her father-in-law spat. Diep felt her heart tighten painfully. She never intended to lose the land deed, she never wanted things to turn out like this. But no matter what she said, they weren't willing to listen. It wasn't enough for them to humiliate her with words. Diep's father-in-law and husband took their anger out on her shack. Her husband stepped forward and kicked the bamboo poles holding it up. The already fragile structure trembled violently. "This piece of trash isn't worth existing," her husband muttered, before ruthlessly tearing down the banana leaf roof. Her father-in-law didn't hesitate either. He grabbed the bamboo frame and yanked it apart, pulling down the last support. In seconds, Diep's small shelter collapsed completely. Dry leaves scattered in the evening wind, bamboo poles crashed to the ground, turning into a pile of wreckage. Diep stood frozen, her eyes wide with shock. She couldn't believe they could be this heartless. No matter how angry they were at her, destroying her shelter meant taking away her last refuge. She looked at her husband, hoping to find even a sliver of pity in his eyes. But there was none. His gaze was cold, devoid of emotion. "You have nowhere else to go now. If you have any sense left, find a way to pay off the debt instead of sitting here crying like a useless fool," her husband said before turning away. Her father-in-law didn't spare her another glance. They left, walking away without looking back, leaving Diep standing in the middle of the wreckage, her heart shattered just like the bamboo sticks strewn on the ground. Pain and despair. Diep fell to her knees, covering her tear-soaked face with trembling hands. She had endured so much, tried to remain patient, but at this moment, she truly felt like she had lost everything. No family, no home, no one on her side. The evening wind blew, chilling her to the bone, but it wasn't as cold as her heart at that moment. She didn't know where to go or what to do next. The only certainty was that she had been pushed to the very edge of despair. One question echoed in her mind: is there any way out for me? James sat on the white sofa in his office, his hands clasped together, his gaze distant and contemplative. The news that Diep's in-laws had destroyed her temporary shelter haunted his mind. He couldn't fathom how a vulnerable woman like Diep could be left without a place to sleep, abandoned and helpless. The image of her sitting alone in the dark, hugging her arms tightly, tears streaming down her face as she warmed herself by a small fire, lingered in his thoughts. Diep didn't deserve this. A deep sense of compassion swelled in James's chest, alongside an unshakable anger at the injustice she was facing. Why does someone as kind as her have to suffer like this? James muttered to himself. His sympathy quickly turned into determination. He couldn't just sit idly by. He had to uncover the truth and help Diep regain what was rightfully hers. James immediately reached out to his contacts in the business and finance world. He went everywhere, asking for information about the missing land deed. One evening, at a roadside cafe, James met with two close friends who could help him investigate. "Any news?" he asked, his eyes filled with anticipation. One of them took a sip of coffee before replying slowly, "I've heard from a few sources that the land deed wasn't actually lost, it was pawned. But we still don't know who did it." James clenched his fists. This was exactly what he had suspected. "Do you know which pawn shop has it?" His other friend nodded. "After some digging, I found out that a nearby pawn shop is holding a land deed and a debt contract connected to Diep." James wasted no time. He immediately drove to the address his friends had provided. The confrontation with the pawn shop owner. Walking into the pawn shop, James scanned the space. It was a small place, packed with valuable items that had been pawned. The shop owner, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes, looked at James with suspicion. "What do you want?" the man asked in a gruff voice. James got straight to the point. "I heard you have a land deed related to Diep. I want to see it." The shop owner narrowed his eyes but, after sensing James's serious demeanor, opened a drawer and pulled out a red folder. "This is the land deed and the debt contract. Someone brought it here to borrow money." James took the documents and carefully examined them. It was indeed Diep's land deed. But what shocked him was the accompanying debt contract. Looking straight at the shop owner, James demanded, "Can you tell me who brought this here?" The man hesitated for a moment before speaking in a low voice. "It wasn't Diep. It was a family member of hers." James tightened his grip on the papers. He had suspected that someone had deliberately pushed Diep into this desperate situation, but hearing it confirmed still filled him with anger. Before leaving, the pawn shop owner gave James another crucial piece of information, a small slip of paper with an address written on it. "I heard she's staying here," the man said. James held the paper, feeling his heart pound. It was an unfamiliar, remote location, a place where Diep had gone to escape the world. While James was searching for her, Diep sat alone in the cold night, next to a small fire. The flickering flames illuminated her tear-streaked face, her eyes swollen with sorrow. She had been abandoned by her in-laws, her last shelter destroyed, and now she had nothing left. Her shoulders trembled from the cold, but the loneliness in her heart was even more unbearable. The fire in front of her crackled, but it couldn't warm the numbness she felt inside. She looked up at the star-filled sky, wondering, "Does anyone in this world still care about me?" She had no idea that, at that very moment, there was a man searching for her, determined to pull her out of the darkness of despair. As dawn broke, James stepped out of his house, holding a stack of important documents, the key to uncovering the truth behind the stolen land title. After days of following leads, he had finally uncovered the secret: Pau's second wife had secretly taken the land title to a pawn shop, exchanging it for cash to conceal her deception. Without hesitation, James reported the case to the local authorities, submitting the evidence and providing the address of the pawn shop. The police swiftly formulated a plan for the arrest. Upon arrival, they surrounded the shop and cautiously approached the room where she was staying. The door burst open, and Pau's second wife stood frozen in shock. Before she could comprehend what was happening, she was taken into custody. That revelation ignited a wave of outrage. Every eye turned toward her, disgust evident on their faces. Lowering her head, she trembled as she walked, realizing there was no way to hide her crime anymore. James stood quietly, feeling a deep sense of relief. At last, the truth had come to light. The days of tracking evidence, tirelessly seeking justice, had finally paid off. As the sun began to rise, he walked away in peace, knowing that justice had been served and that those responsible could no longer escape the consequences of their actions. The case had come to a close, but James understood that sometimes, uncovering the truth required persistence and the unwavering will to never give up. Diep woke up to the cold morning air, rubbing her hands together to warm herself beside the nearly extinguished embers of her small fire. The early mist covered everything, making the scenery gloomy, but the chill in her heart was even colder. Her decision was clear: she would not return to her husband's house. She couldn't. She had endured enough. The lies, the betrayal, and the suffocating life in that house had made her feel like a prisoner. Now, her heart longed for freedom, for a faraway place where she could truly breathe in peace. Taking a deep breath, she stood up and started walking. Her bare feet touched the damp earth still wet with night dew, but she didn't care. Every step she took was another step away from the past, moving toward a future she would shape with her own hands. She walked all morning, passing through fields and following a small path leading into the forest. The light breeze rustled the leaves, as if whispering encouragement to her, urging her forward. As noon approached, she came across a woman sitting in a small garden, holding a baby in her arms. The woman looked exhausted but continued working, carefully picking fresh greens and placing them into a woven basket. There was no one beside her, no man to help. It was just her and the little child. Diep stopped and watched silently. A deep sense of empathy surged within her. That image reminded her of herself, of the lonely days trapped in a cold marriage. She understood the struggles this woman faced. "Good morning," Diep said softly. The woman looked up, slightly surprised to see her. "Good morning," she responded cautiously. "Where is your husband? Why are you working alone?" Diep asked with concern. The woman quietly shook her head, her eyes filled with sorrow. "He left a long time ago. Said he was going to the city to find work, but he never came back. I have to take care of my child alone." Diep felt her heart ache. Somewhere in this world, there were women suffering just like her, or even worse. But this woman had no choice, she had to keep going for her child. "You are very strong," Diep whispered, admiration in her voice. The woman gave a faint smile, gently stroking the sleeping child's hair. "It's not about strength. I just have no other option. I must live for my child." Diep remained silent. She sat down beside her and picked up a bunch of vegetables, placing them into the basket. "Let me help you." The woman looked at her hesitantly but then nodded with gratitude. Two women, one escaping fate, the other struggling to endure it, quietly worked together. Diep helped the woman finish her task, then stood up and looked ahead. Her heart felt a little lighter, though still filled with many thoughts. She no longer felt alone. As the sky began to turn golden with the setting sun, Diep realized that no matter how harsh life was, there would always be resilient people moving forward. And perhaps, she could do the same. A gust of wind blew, carrying fallen leaves along with it. Diep smiled, a soft but determined smile. She would continue her journey. She did not yet know her destination, but she was no longer afraid.
Bài thơ đồng chí. Quê hương anh nước mặn đồng chua, làng tôi nghèo đất cải nên sỏi đá. Anh với tôi đôi người xa lạ, tự phương trời chẳng hẹn quen nhau. Súng bên súng đầu xác bên đầu, đêm rét chung chăn thành đôi chi kỷ. Đồng chí, ruộng nương anh gửi bạn thân cải. Gian nhà không mặc kệ gió lung lay, giếng nước gốc đa nhớ người ra nính. Anh với tôi biết từng cơn ớn lạnh, sốt run người vầng trán ướt mồ hôi. Áo anh rách vai, quần tôi có vài mảnh vá, miệng cười buốt giá, chân không dày. Thương nhau tay nắm lấy bàn tay. Đêm nay rừng hoang sương muối, đứng cạnh bên nhau chờ giặc tới, đầu súng trong treo. Bài thơ đồng chí được sáng tác vào đầu năm 1948, sau khi tác giả đã cùng đồng đội tham gia vào chiến đấu trong chiến dịch Việt Bắc Thu Đông năm 1947, đánh bại cuộc tổng tiến công quy mô lớn của giặc Pháp nên chiến khu Việt Bắc. Bài thơ là một trong những tác phẩm tiêu biểu nhất về người lính cách mạng của văn học kháng chiến chống Pháp từ năm 1946 đến năm 1954.